But there should be a reason why you're setting up a self-managed super fund if you are going to do it. And it's generally reserved for people with larger balances.
Welcome to 360 Money Matters, where financial planners Billy and Andrew talk all things financial planning. This podcast aims to increase your knowledge and confidence with all things money. Each week, they will cover topics like wealth creation strategies, investment principles, creating passive income, paying off your debt faster, and much, much more, so you can live a life on your terms without limits.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the 360 Money Matters podcast. I'm Billy and I'm joined by my co-host,
Andrew. Bills, here we are. We are back again.
Back again, Andrew. Favourite time of the week where we bring a whole heap of value to our listeners and our viewers.
And you get to talk to me.
And we get to talk to you. That's exactly right. That's exactly right for the next 15 minutes or so. Andrew, straight into it. What are we talking to everybody about today?
So today we're talking about a self-managed super fund. What is it? Why do I constantly hear about it? Should I have a self-managed super fund? So we're going to just do a run through in terms of pros, cons, benefits, risks, basically a deep dive onto self-managed super funds.
There we go. You want me to kick it off, Andrew?
Kick it off, Bill.
Alrighty, let's do it. So, as the name suggests, the second part, the SF in the SMSF, it's a superannuation fund, right? So it's no different to any other fund. There's a little bit of difference in the investment options, but we'll talk about that in a sec. So superannuation, all of the rules surrounding it remain the same, albeit a few intricacies, which we will discuss later. But the SM, self-managed, is probably the part that I wanted to focus on. In a regular superannuation fund that's not an SMSF, that's not a self-managed super fund, you have a trustee that is managing the superannuation fund to make sure that it's compliant, it's ticking all of the boxes, it's doing all of the right things. When you have a self-managed super fund, you, as the superannuation, you become the superannuation trustee.
Yep.
So you become responsible for making sure that the management and the running of the superannuation fund ticks all of the boxes that a trustee is responsible for ticking. Compliance, the investment strategy is in place. It's operating for the sole purpose of providing retirement income for somebody down the track. So That's the really headline difference from that perspective, is that you become the trustee and you're completely responsible for, with some other professionals that will sit around that, your accountant, your financial advisor, the accountant that does the tax return, the accountant that does the fund audit. But ultimately that responsibility shifts to you as the individual.
Yeah, exactly right. And that's how the ATO will view it. I mean, you can have an advisor on the account, you can have an accountant that's ultimately helping you with it. But like when you're doing your personal tax return, the responsibility is on you. If there's a mistake, if there's an issue, if anything happens, ultimately the responsibility fully falls on you. So you're liable for all of the decision making, including, the investment strategy. And that's ultimately, for the most reason why people will go into a self-managed super fund is because of the level of control. From an investment standpoint, you can invest in basically anything that's for investment purposes, and we'll run through some specifics around what that looks like and how people utilize this. But for all intents and purposes, if you were to set up a self-managed super fund and move the balance of your self-managed or the balance of your existing superannuation into a self-managed super fund, the funds would literally go into a bank account that you can view and see like normal, regular money, and it's still for the same purpose. So you can't pull money out and use it individually. It has to be used only for investment purposes. You still need to comply by all of the exact same superannuation rules in that you can't draw money out unless you've met a condition of release. The barriers around being able to do it are removed. So, for instance, I have seen before people that have accidentally moved money from their self-managed super fund to pay a bill because they thought that they were paying a bill from their regular bank account.
Accidentally.
Triggers a whole raft of issues when you're going through your audit every year and your auditor's looking at the transactions. And so the benefit around flexibility and control is most certainly there. But on the flip side, the risk around something potentially going wrong is also there as well, because you don't have those barriers.
So easy to make a mistake.
Exactly
And
right.
a lot more responsibility.
Yeah.
Cost associated with running it as well too. So at the moment you would pay in terms of the administration and management of a superannuation fund, you would pay a fee. It might be a platform fee, it might be a trustee fee, it might be an admin fee.
Yep.
That's just how it's done. We've still got the investment costs associated with it, but when you do that yourself, you're paying, there's a couple of different things, but there's the registration fee every year. You need to get the fund audited by an SMSF auditor to make sure that the fund is compliant. And you also need to employ the services of an accountant to do the tax returns for the fund each year. So if you kind of assume that there's cost on both sides when you do compare and contrast the two, there are costs. So it's not like you can get away from those costs. That the SMSF one, the setup fees are a lot more expensive because you're paying to set up. Whereas if you just open up an ordinary superannuation fund or a non-SMSF super fund, there's no cost to opening it up with the product provider per se. And then above and beyond that, you've still got to consider the investment strategy that sits with it, which is probably a good place to pivot into in terms of how this differentiates.
Yeah. So generally speaking, I mean, it's pretty safe to say that in a self-managed super fund environment, you are paying higher costs because there are costs that
No doubt.
you're not paying in the regular superannuation environment. So there should, and I don't want to say always, because I've seen some crazy things that people do, but there should be a reason why you're setting up a self-managed super fund if you are going to do it. And it's generally reserved for people with larger balances, because if you
need to
consider
justify the cost.
Yeah, like the cost is a relatively fixed cost. It's not necessarily a percentage-based fee or anything like that. And so you need to have a large enough balance to outweigh all of the additional costs that are associated with it. You also consider that there is some complexity when you're talking about people reaching a particular preservation age. And what I mean by that is, Billy's in his 50s, I'm in my 30s. If we had a self-managed super fund together, assuming that Billy, is in his 60s and maybe now I'm in my 40s.
60s.
No,
Jesus.
I'm going forward a decade.
Nice.
Billy's in his 60s, I'm in my 40s. All of a sudden, on Billy's portion of his superannuation, so even though the balance is combined, so when you've got multiple members, on Billy's portion of his superannuation, he maybe wants to move it to a pension phase product so that he can start to not pay tax on any of the growth or income that's associated with it. I cannot move my balance into a pension phase product. And if there's an asset that you're not necessarily drawing a level of income out of, or there isn't surplus funds in the self-managed super fund, the fund needs to pay an income to Billy to meet the minimum pension payments. It can't pay an income to me. And so how you manage that can be very complex. Now, this is a simple scenario, but when there's multiple members, there's multiple preservation ages, you need to consider what assets are you ultimately investing in, how's it going to be structured, and how's it going to pay one person an income and not the other person an income. So can be a level of complexity with that as well.
Yeah, good to point out that the complexity in using this instance actually increases over time.
Yeah, exactly right.
So your level of involvement also increases as well too. So yeah, I think ultimately if we're trying to sum up that, you need to have the appetite for it, because you are taking on a greater responsibility. But talking about why people would do this, I mean, look, people love the idea that there's additional control associated with this. So you have to be that way inclined. I think that's probably the secondary reason that we see in here. But the predominant one that we tend to see is because of the assets that you can purchase inside a self-managed superannuation fund. The main one is property. Andrew will come to that in a sec, but you can also purchase other types of assets that you couldn't necessarily get access to in a non-self-managed super fund. things like commodities, so you can buy, gold, silver, diamonds, bits and pieces like that. If you've got the skill set and the inclination, there are certain circumstances where you could buy things like, some collectibles, artwork, wine, bits and pieces like that. There are really stringent rules around that because you can't enjoy them in today's sense.
Yeah.
You can't enjoy them, and I'll give an example of this. They have to be preserved for retirement. So as an example, if you bought a piece of art, you have to go and store it off-site. It has to be insured. It has to be locked up. You can't hang it on your wall because you're not eligible to access your superannuation yet. If it's hanging on your wall, it's being that you're enjoying that asset.
Yeah, exactly the same thing with a collectible car or something.
Exactly,
you can't
the same
drive
thing.
it, you can't utilize it for personal benefit.
Yep.
It's purely an investment asset.
Yeah. So Andrew, let's talk about the property because that's really the main one that we tend to see.
Yeah.
That people want to purchase property with self-managed super funds.
Yeah, and look, this can be a really powerful strategy. In particular, if you're selecting the right property, if you're doing it in the right manner, and you're structuring things correctly, you need to consider the full suite of circumstances. But when you're considering property, for instance, and maybe it's a residential property, maybe it's a commercial property, but one, you can pull your benefit, or you can utilize the benefit of a spouse, so a family unit being able to pull superannuation funds together to have a larger balance and potentially facilitate purchasing a larger property. You can use the power of leveraging. So in the regular or non-self-managed super fund environment, a superannuation fund is not allowed to take on borrowings.
Yeah.
However, in a self-managed super fund, utilizing a bare trust, there is a way to be able to do it. And so you look at the power, but also the risk, that the power of leveraging and the power of being able to use the bank's money is available in the self-managed super fund environment or the SMSF environment that's not available in the other environment.
Yep.
And I think that there's also just a certain level of comfort that's associated with purchasing a property, particularly when you're considering property in Australia. It's an asset class that people and consumers really have an affinity towards, I think, because you can see it, you understand it, you know how it works, and there's just been so many people that have been successful in investing in property. And so for a lot of people, the main driver towards a self-managed super fund is property. Now, that does come with its own risks, and it does come with its own considerations. And there are a lot, but we'll maybe narrow it down to a few. But one, if you're taking on borrowings, you need to be able to make the repayments. If your super contributions are not coming in, how are those repayments ultimately going to be made? Depending on whether that property is delivering a rental income and how much that rental income is. If someone decides to take time off work, for a career break, for maternity leave, for any number of reasons, if the income's not coming into superannuation, how are you going to facilitate not just repayments, but paying off that property? The stamp duty costs. So you consider in its, initial stage, I need to have enough money in order to, set up a self-managed super fund and the costs associated with it. I now need to pay stamp duty costs in order to purchase a property. So how much is it actually costing you just to get into a particular asset? And, what's the ultimate strategy at the end of it? Is it that you're going to sell this property and, invest in, a multitude of assets afterwards when you move into a retirement phase, and you're going to take advantage of the fact that you can make a capital gain and pay 0% tax on capital gains tax because you've moved it into retirement phase? Or, is that property going to deliver the required level of income to facilitate your lifestyle when you do move to retirement phase? So if you are considering property, I think that it sounds good on the surface, but making sure that it's the right thing for you, for your circumstances, for your goals is critically important. Because the cost of entering that type of asset and the cost of, transacting on this, it's not insignificant.
Yeah, probably two things that I'd want to add around the property piece, because I think these are really substantial and often overlooked. But you go and purchase a property, and let's say you've got it paid off and it's worth $1 million by the time you retire, and it's generating let's call it a healthy yield of 5%. That's 50 grand a year on an asset that's worth $1 million. With a property, you can't do anything to increase that. I mean, you might be able to a little bit, but if you needed 100 grand as an income stream in that particular year, you can't go and do anything about that unless you sell the property down. It's as simple as that. The other thing too, especially when you consider people who have bought, let's call it lifestyle assets. So you go and say, okay, I'm going to go and buy a property. We're in Victoria, so we always love to talk about property in Queensland. I'm going to go and buy a property in Queensland in my SMSF, thinking that when I retire and it becomes accessible, I can actually use that as a lifestyle asset. That's actually not the case. You can't do that. You can't do that. It has to remain an investment. You can't go and decide to have a sea change and go and live there, even though that asset you've retired, it's accessible, you can access it. You can't actually do that.
Yeah, unless you basically pull
you
the
sell
property.
it. You sell it to yourself.
Correct.
Stamp duty is a consideration, and all of the costs associated with the transaction.
Yeah.
So you need to be really mindful around why you're setting it up and what that looks like. But it's definitely a worthwhile consideration that we see all of the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that really the key takeaway out of it is, if you are considering a self-managed super fund, getting advice is critically important.
You have to. Yep.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Bills, thanks very much for that one. Appreciate all of our listeners and our viewers jumping on the podcast and having a listen to, some general insights around the self-managed super fund and how and why it may be beneficial. If you've got any questions or you wanted to reach out to either Billy or myself, details are in the show notes. Otherwise, we look forward to catch you on the next podcast.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening today. If you have any questions on what we've talked about or would like to have a chat about your money journey, visit us at 360fs.com.au.
Just a reminder to our listeners that the information contained in this podcast is general in nature and it is not intended as personal recommendations for the audience. Please consider whether the information suits your circumstances before acting on it. This information is provided by Billy Amaritis and Andrew Nicolaou of 360 Financial Strategists Proprietary Limited, authorised representatives and credit representatives of AMP Financial Planning.